Good evening. Welcome to Vampire Reviews. I am the Maven of the Eventide, and you are the children of the night. I'm assuming, because you're up watching YouTube videos instead of doing that thing you should be doing. I'm just kidding. Please don't leave me. Tonight, we are finally talking about one of the books that's been on my vampire bookshelf for a while. Yes, my vampire library is growing, spawning. I even had to get a second bookcase, which you can't see because it's over there. This is Straight Outta Fangton by bestselling author C.T. Phipps, and it is the vampiriest vampire book that ever vampired. Yeah, I have it in 3 editions. This one, the ebook, and the audiobook. The audiobook is narrated by the fantastically versatile actor Carrie Height, and he does an amazing job. I don't usually read with my ears, but I'm glad I did for this one. His narration for this novel was even a finalist this year for the Audiobook Listener's Choice Awards. That category says paranormal, but more specifically, this is an urban fantasy novel. When it comes to vampire books in this day and age, the urban fantasy genre is where you are going to find most of them. Urban fantasy means that you have a world where fantasy creatures, like vampires, exist in the modern, real-world society, either in secret or out in the open, commingling with the regular human population. And most urban fantasies deal with, at least on some level, how those fantasy creatures are treated as part of society by the humans. Sometimes urban fantasies will just have one type of creature, but more often they go the route of, well, if vampires exist, then so do werewolves and fairies and who knows what else. And this book goes all the way with that idea. There are supernatural creatures in this book that I've never even heard of before. In Straight Outta Fangton's universe, vampires and other supernatural creatures have been out in the open for some years now, and the world has acclimated to their existence, though of course they still struggle with being accepted by humans, and plenty of bigots still want to murder them. The vampires consider themselves the top tier of supernatural creatures, because of course they do, and the book focuses on a vampire protagonist and his mostly vampire associates. Though this author is writing other books set in this world focused on different supernatural creatures, such as I Was a Teenage Weredeer, which came out earlier this year. The Straight Outta Fangton title is a play on the name of that old gangsta rap album by NWA, you know, Straight Outta Compton, but with a really cheesy vampire pun in it. And that pretty much sums up this book in a nutshell. What's a vampire-y way of saying nutshell? Coffin? Shell? Vampire? Nut? Anyway, the title conveys the gritty urban flavor of the book's Detroit setting, while including a dated 80s pop culture reference and an eye-roll-worthy vampire joke. And those things make up about 50% of the book's pages. The title drop comes pretty early in the book when the protagonist, Peter Stone, an impoverished convenience store clerk, formerly tangentially connected to the gangster lifestyle, who happens to be a black vampire, mentions that he could have been the next big thing in rap, straight out of Fangton. Har har. Until his sidekick and best friend, David, a sassy bisexual sci-fi obsessed white guy, reminds Peter that he can't rhyme. Yeah, the book's subtitle is A Comedic Vampire Story, just to make sure browsing readers don't take its urbanness too seriously, though it is also dark and gritty and violent at the same time, with plenty of bloody shootout fight scenes, car chases, sadistic villains, hot action girls in skin-tight outfits, and swole dudes in black leather with ancient blades made out of demon bones, and all the other trappings any discerning genre reader could ever desire out of a sincere work of urban fantasy. And Peter's delusion about being a rapper is pretty much the only thing he's not self-aware about. As the first-person narrator of the book, he delivers the nerdiest meta and pop culture reference-riddled vampire story ever. If there is a vampire film or book or TV show you've ever heard of, Peter mentions it at least once, either as a joke or to compare to how real vampires work in this world. Some of these jokes are explained, maybe a little too explained sometimes, but some are slipped in subtly for the amusement of the truly savvy vampire fan. The audiobook narrator, Carrie Height, captures Peter's ironic tone and light-hearted sarcasm perfectly. He also does an amazing job with all the other characters, from the wide variety of complex female characters in the book to the truly sadistic and literally diabolical villain. Seriously, I just want this actor to narrate everything from now on, please. Now, I don't want to tell you all about the plot of this book. It is relatively new and from a small press publisher, so I'm pretty sure 99% of you haven't read it yet. But what I do want to talk about tonight is a bit about how the concept of the vampire is addressed. The book includes an introduction, which explains that after the popular success of the author's Rules of Supervillainy book series, which sends up all the tropes of superheroes, he was approached by this publisher to write a new series using vampire tropes in the same vein. Vein, get it? I'll be here all night, folks. All night, alone, with my books. But the comedy of the book isn't slapstick or mockery like a vampire parody would be. The story itself is actually rather dark and terrifying, and Peter himself is not a joke. Instead, the humor is one of a gallows sort and stems from Peter's self-awareness. He is a relatively new vampire, only a few years old, viewing vampire society around him through a meta and ironic lens. In this world, all vampire fiction exists, and was actually mostly created by vampires over the years as a way to try to soften humanity up to the idea of vampires before they finally revealed themselves to the world. And Peter has educated himself on all of it, because he is a huge super nerd. And he can't help but compare the dark, grim reality of the vampire life to the fiction his species has projected since Dracula was first published. As a result of his meta-awareness, he is one of the most morally centered vampires you've ever met, calling out the bullshit and hypocrisy, double standards, and problematic elements of vampire existence wherever he sees them, even as he's still forced to participate in them due to his nature. Because what it comes down to from a philosophical ethics perspective is that there is no right or good way to be a vampire. In our current era of vampire popularity, where so many authors and filmmakers and artists are trying their hand at what they think a vampire should be, there are plenty of interpretations that would like the vampire to represent a truly innocent and unfairly ostracized member of society, an outcast who doesn't deserve to be an outcast. But this book's introduction states that people forget that vampires, as cool and sexy as they might sometimes be, are monsters. And they are. Even if for no other reason than the power balance dynamics. Power is inherently monstrous. In Straight Outta Fangton's universe, after vampires revealed their existence, there was an explosion in vampire population because so many people thought it would be awesome to be one and got themselves turned. These people are portrayed as naive. No idea what they're getting themselves into with all the dark sides of vampire existence. Unlike many vampire interpretations that like to play down vampire weaknesses to things like crosses and garlic and mirrors, this book goes overboard with the weaknesses to examine the consequences of a naive pursuit of power. And the weaknesses range from serious and lethal, like a cross melting a vampire's face off, to humorously ridiculous, like a debilitating hypnotic obsession with counting sesame seeds. The population explosion of new vampires in this story is much to the dismay of the older vampires, who look upon them as weak blood, second-class citizens. And classism and elitist snobbery are huge running themes in this story, among the vampires themselves, as well as how they compare themselves to other supernaturals and humans, of course. The plot even centers around class warfare. Peter often compares their interspecies dynamic to racism and never shies away from calling it out. Becoming a vampire is presented as an allegory for transitioning from poverty to the privilege of the nouveau riche, with most vampires letting their new class status change their worldview to look down on the impoverished people they were once a part of. Except for Peter, because he's woke. Vampires compare humans to monkeys, believe they are not as enlightened as vampires. One older vampire even invokes the imperialist concept of the white man's burden, even though most of these vampires aren't white, when she tells Peter, "You think of us as predators, but we are actually humanity's protectors. We have helped bring many wars and conflicts to a swift close, as well as help safeguard the environment. We have nurtured cities, the arts, learning, and culture, where human leaders would have had their people fall into superstition or poverty. Vampires are the shepherds of humanity." Peter's response to this is, yeah, the better to shear them. Even though Peter doesn't want to be like the other racist, classist, abusive, essentially rapist vampires, he still has to find a way to cope with his own vampire nature and the fact that he benefits from the privileges of being part of a society that has oppressed others. It is essentially impossible to not be at least a little bit of the monster he literally is. His sense of humor is a big part of this coping mechanism. He tries to live off animal blood, even though vampires can't do this completely in this world without their minds dissolving, and biting people is always thoroughly sexual here. He also tries not to use his hypnotic mind control powers. At one point, he hypnotizes his friend David to get him to do what he needs to do for David's own safety and to win the fight they're in, and also because David is being seriously obnoxious. And Peter has a moment where he's like, yeah, this is great. I should have done this a long time ago. But when David snaps out of it, he takes Peter to task for how rapey it is, and Peter truly does not want to ever do it again. It's not that Peter doesn't want to be a vampire. He just wants to be one as responsibly as he can. As he points out, humans can be monsters too, even without all the cool powers. It all comes down to one's own personal choices. And he sees a huge difference in his attitude here compared to the classic trope of the self-loathing vampire. He even says self-hating vampires are the worst at one point, in reference to this hyper-religious vampire whose life's mission is to destroy all other vampires, as he considers them abominations to God despite being one himself. Peter's not like that guy. We see several villainous forces of evil represented in this book. It doesn't just pick one. Besides the religious zealotry and the class warfare elitism, there's also the government. We find out that the US government entertained a genocide plan to wipe out all supernatural creatures, and this is a big part of why vampire society had to form as it did. And here, vampires serve as a metaphor of the way threatening minority groups have been treated by bigoted hegemonic governments across history. As one vampire points out, only fools think the government is ever their friend. Or perhaps love is the true evil. One supernatural person we meet is cursed to never feel love or have love felt for him. So therefore, he is immune to vampires. They aren't interested in drinking his blood, as the act is considered an act of love because it is so sexual. And if the monster and love are one and the same, what does that mean? Vampire society in this world is so concerned with aesthetic, money, living that vampire lifestyle. And as Peter starts the book in exile from the Vampire High Society, working as a wage slave at the equivalent of a 7-Eleven, he is uniquely positioned to see through the bullshit of the image most vampires are so desperate to cultivate, while still being a little jealous and bitter about not getting his share of it. Neither is he part of the flip side of vampire society in this world, the rebellious underground network of young ones who want to fight for supernatural equality instead of letting the oldest, richest vampires, 1%, rule everything. Meanwhile, the ancient ones genuinely consider themselves superior beings because they've proven that they have the ability to survive immense changes in history, society, and culture. And doesn't the world always talk a big talk about benefiting from the wisdom of the past? Our protagonist, Peter, doesn't know what the right answers are for how vampires should live or what is best for the world. All he can do is endure one night at a time, trying to be the best, most woke vampire he can be, continually check his privilege, be conscious of his shortcomings, and crack super nerdy jokes. Because there is no ethical consumption under vampirism. Ah, consumption! Get it? Because they eat people. I'm the Maven of the Eventide, and I think I just did a spoiler-free vampire review for once. If you like meta humor and 80s and 90s pop culture references and amazingly talented audiobook narrators, then you will get a kick out of this novel. It's like if the vampire section of TV tropes had an adorably sarcastic baby with your deep dive socioeconomics ethics philosophy class. Thank you to my Patreon patrons for making these vampire videos possible. If you'd like to help me make more videos like this, please join my Patreon. Every little bit helps. Thanks especially to the patron who requested the review of this book as a gift for his friend. You can do that. Merry Christmas, Happy Vamp Holidays, whatever you celebrate. Because I am obsessed with books and making lists, I've put together a list of all the vampire books on my bookshelves for all of you who've been asking me about them. I've got it up on Amazon storefronts, here, if you want to browse and beef up your own vampire library. What's a vampire-y way of saying beef up? Blood up? Add new blood to your bookshelf? Bookshelf? Like a ghost? Because vampires are dead? Never mind. Good night.